So I was in New York City recently on some important Nebula business. I didn't spend much time in New York though. Just enough time to eat some great tacos and see some of the street improvements that have happened over the past few years. It really is impressive what they've managed to build in such a short period of time. Ultimately, I was on my way to Canada to see family, so I needed to get from New York to Toronto. I could fly in just under 2 hours, plus the typical 2 or more extra hours of airport nonsense. The drive could be done in 8 hours, though it would probably take longer with traffic and the border crossing. So, of course, I chose to take Amtrak, because I'm a train-loving masochist. This train was scheduled to take 12 and a half hours, and to their credit, we arrived pretty close to that time, pulling into Toronto Union Station in just under 13 hours. All in all, this trip went about as well as it could have, and it's a good example of the best case scenario for this train. So let me show you what it's like to take a cross-border Amtrak train these days, how it compares to some of my other train trips this year, and when we're done, I want to talk about the next train I took in Canada, because if you think Amtrak is bad, Via Rail has a new baggage policy, and oh boy, do I need to rant about it. Public transit in New York is known for being very comprehensive, but sometimes really old and in dire need of repair. So it was very nice to see that my train was departing from the newly renovated Moynihan train station at Penn Station. The new train hall is really nice, spacious, and bright, with lots of natural light coming in from the skylight above. Though it is an interesting choice to build a train hall without any seating so that everyone needs to sit on the floor. And it's also bizarre that there isn't like a big departure board like every train hall ever. The only one I could find without leaving the train hall was this one. Attached to the train hall are some shops, as well as a food court. And the proper departure board that should probably be in the train hall itself. Apart from the lack of seating, this is a pretty nice building. This should really be the norm for US train stations. My train left at 7:15 in the morning, which was a painfully early time to catch a train, which is why I booked a hotel literally across the street from the station. At this time in the morning, the train hall was a lot quieter. The food court was closed, but it was still possible to buy a bagel at least. I was going to explore the station and waiting area, but then I found that travelers to Canada needed to check in early to have their passports checked, and then we needed to wait in this ridiculously long line. If you're traveling to Canada from here, make sure you print a paper ticket because apparently they need to stamp it. About 20 minutes before departure, they let all the Canadian-bound passengers board first because Canadians are better than Americans, and so I boarded the train. Business class, of course, because if I'm going to spend 12 and a half hours on a train, I want a comfortable seat. If you'd like to ensure that I travel business class on every train I take, then you can support this channel on Nebula. But seriously, this train costs $134 for coach and $195 for business class, so I figured it was probably worth paying the extra $4.80 per hour for more comfort. To put that into perspective though, if you book early enough, you can get a flight for as low as $80, plus the cost of getting to and from the airport, of course. The seats in business class were very old but spacious, and they reclined pretty well. The seats had a good-sized tray table and power sockets too. The coach class seats were closer together and narrower to fit a 2x2 configuration, but they still looked pretty comfy. The one benefit to riding on an older train is that they were built to a more luxurious standard. They don't build them like they used to. While it might be faster to fly, the real reason to take this train is the views. It really is quite pretty, especially on the west side of the train. We stopped at some cute old train stations with silly names like Poughkeepsie and Schenectady. We even stopped in Amsterdam. I wish I knew that before. I could have saved myself an international flight. We also had a short stop in Rome, but I couldn't see the Colosseum. Some of the towns we passed through had definitely seen better days, and the later part of the journey did not have the nicest scenery unless you have a thing for surface parking lots. I also got to experience the time-honored American tradition of sitting around and waiting for a freight train to pass because the freight companies own the track and their trains get priority. The law says they're supposed to give priority to passenger trains, but this is almost never enforced, so whenever a segment of track is needed by 2 trains, the freight train usually wins out, over the passenger train. Amtrak recommends using their app to track the progress of the train while en route. Unfortunately, when I tried to log into the app, it would get stuck in a loop and bump me back to the login screen. I managed to get into the status page with a web browser, but it would hang when trying to update. So it seems like Amtrak's IT department is about as well funded as you'd expect it to be. Eventually, I just used this third-party site, which helpfully also showed how late we were running. When we weren't slowed due to freight trains, our top speed was around 125 kilometers per hour, which is higher than the highway speed limit in New York, but this is still obviously not a high-speed train. I find that long train journeys aren't really a problem though, because it's so comfortable to sit on a train. When you're in a car, you're strapped down and can't move. You can't even get up to take a piss. I hate sitting in a car for long periods of time, especially if I'm driving, because you kind of have to pay attention to the road the whole time or everybody dies a fiery death. And on an airplane, it's loud, the air is dry, the seats are cramped, and the food tastes terrible at altitude. So after about 5 or 6 hours on an airplane, I am tapped out and wanting to get off. But because trains are so much more comfortable, I can last a lot longer.
We do apologize for this delay.
On a train, you can look out the window, get up and walk around and stretch your legs, go to the bar car, or write a script for a YouTube video. This train had free Wi-Fi, and while not exactly super fast, reliability was much better than I expected. Certainly better than any airplane Wi-Fi. So I was able to easily get work done on the train, which made the trip surprisingly productive. I had a late lunch in the bar car as we passed through Rochester. The chicken banh mi wasn't amazing, but it was way better than airplane food. This sandwich plus a cup of tea was $10. As we got into this part of the trip, the views became less scenic and mostly farmland, but it was still pretty nice. At this point, we were running about half an hour late, but the schedule promised to make up that time before we got to the border. Also, Amtrak doesn't employ a janitor, so the toilets were not looking so great after 10 hours. We arrived at Niagara Falls Station on the US side and waited for a really long time. I thought that maybe they were swapping to a Canadian locomotive or something, but apparently not. But eventually, we departed the dismal city of Niagara Falls, New York, crossed the bridge, and entered the slightly less dismal city of Niagara Falls, Ontario. When I saw the Via sign and Go Bus, I knew that I was finally back in the Great White North. Land of maple syrup, poutine, hockey, beavers, Nanaimo bars, ketchup chips, butter tarts, pineapple on pizza, Mounties, plaid flannel shirts, moose, evergreen forest, donuts that used to be good before they merged with Burger King, people who apologize when you step on their toe, the largest highway in North America, and way too many cars. When we arrived at the station, we had to pack up all of our luggage and go into the station for passport control, which I wasn't allowed to film, but to be honest, it was pretty uneventful. Though it is interesting that this is the last time I'll ever enter Canada on a Canadian passport, so I guess that's a thing. Then we walked outside in the rain and were herded into a small waiting room. But after about 45 minutes, they let us all back onto the train. I went back to my seat, the announcements became bilingual, the Wi-Fi stopped working, and we left Niagara Falls Station right on 15 minutes late. The quality of the track was noticeably worse on the Canadian side. The train was rocking quite a bit more than it was in New York, even though we were traveling at a third of the speed. These are tracks owned by the freight railroad CN, and clearly they're not really into stuff like track maintenance, which is the other big problem with passenger trains running on tracks owned by freight companies that typically run their trains much slower and don't care. And of course, the train slowed down and stopped several times for no apparent reason. I'm sure these drivers appreciated us coming to a full stop for several minutes right over a level crossing. But once we got off CN's shitty tracks and onto the government-owned GO Transit tracks at Aldershot, we started going consistently faster, which again is the fundamental issue with Via Rail. It's always going to suck as long as they ride on the tracks owned by the freight railroads. As I watched the sun set on the car-infested wasteland that is Canadian suburbia, I started to think, would I recommend this trip to other people? Maybe. It depends how much you love trains. Because if you're not fond of train journeys that are longer than they need to be, then you'd probably be better off flying. You really need to be okay sitting on a train that you know should be so much faster if the US and Canada would just put even a fraction of the hundreds of billions that they spend on road projects into making passenger rail service better. But if you can put that aside and appreciate the journey, then you'll enjoy some nice scenery, a comfortable seat, and a pretty relaxing way to travel. But it's just so frustrating that the richest country in the world can't run a train better than this, between the most populous city in the US and the most populous city in Canada. New York to Toronto is similar to the distance between Amsterdam and Berlin, a trip I just took a few weeks ago and which took just over 6 hours. And this was not a high-speed train. When this old clunker showed up, I thought, wow, Deutsche Bahn is clearly saving their absolute worst rolling stock for their Netherlands routes. But it still got there in less than half the time as the Amtrak train. What's more insane is that New York to Toronto is almost exactly the same distance as Tokyo to Hiroshima, a trip I took earlier this year. This trip took just under 4 hours. If Amtrak were as fast as a Japanese Shinkansen, my trip would have taken a third as long, which would be much faster than driving. And likely faster than flying too, once you factor in all the extra time it takes getting to, from, and through the airport. I have a previous video about how high-speed rail in Italy has basically made domestic air travel obsolete, if you'd like to learn more. And if we have any interest in cutting carbon emissions, the train wins every time. Flying emits over 200 grams of CO2 per person kilometer. Driving a gasoline car is about 170. Taking this diesel Amtrak train comes out to around 100 grams, but if it were a high-speed electric train, it could be as low as 4. The world needs more high-speed electric trains, especially for distances under 800 kilometers. New York to Toronto would be an absolutely ideal route for high-speed rail, but there are many, many others. So while this train ride wasn't terrible, it really wasn't good enough either. America deserves better train service than this. But while it could be argued that Amtrak is doing its best while being chronically underfunded, Via Rail in Canada seems determined to make train travel as painful as possible. While I was in Canada, we needed to go from Toronto to my hometown of London, Ontario, and since driving on the 401 is absolutely awful these days, we decided to take the train. Now, I've talked about Canadian train travel several times before on this channel. I've talked about the long queues to board the train, the staff weighing suitcases, the ancient train cars, the painfully slow speeds, or stopped completely waiting for a freight train to pass, and whatever you call the polar opposite of level boarding. I've described the experience before as all the pain of flying while taking longer than driving. And I found it funny that their new ads show places that you can't even get to without a car, but I'm sorry to say, it's actually gotten worse. First of all, Via Rail has increased their prices a lot. The round-trip fare for our family of 4 to fake London was $510. Fortunately, I had some frequent traveler points that brought the price down, but those points are gone now, so I guess we're never taking this train again. Now, Dutch people love to tell me how trains in the Netherlands are way too expensive, and I agree they should absolutely be cheaper. But Toronto to London is almost exactly the same distance as Amsterdam to Groningen. Even if we paid full price, which we would never do, that trip would be about 180 euros here in the Netherlands. With an off-peak discount, it would be 110. But of course, if we actually took a trip to Groningen, we'd purchase an NS group ticket, so the entire round trip for all 4 of us would be 73 euros. Meanwhile, Via Rail wanted over 330 euros. And what's worse is that Via only offers 6 trains per day between Toronto and London, while there are 55 trains per day between Amsterdam and Groningen. It's not even comparable. And you're probably already wondering, why the hell do they weigh your bags before getting on a train? Well, that's gotten worse too. Because Via has now implemented a new luggage policy, and it's basically the same as an airline. Now, airplanes have luggage restrictions because they need to, fly through the air. But trains don't typically do that. Via says that they need to weigh your bags for safety reasons because Canadian labor laws state that employees cannot be required to lift more than 50 pounds without assistance. So if you need help lifting your luggage, it needs to be under that amount, which Seems crazy, but given how ridiculously difficult it is to hike up into a VIA train, I can almost believe that's a legitimate problem, but this new baggage policy is not that. And I can hear you say, surely they wouldn't actually enforce such a ridiculous policy for a train, right? Well, let me tell you a story. I was traveling to a lot of cities on this trip, so I was traveling light, one carry-on suitcase and a backpack, and that was absolutely fine on every part of my trip. But on our trip back to Toronto, I had a lunch bag, and this put me over the new Via Rail baggage requirements. They stopped us and said we'd need to pay $25 for this extra baggage if we wanted to take it with us. For a train. There was a lot of storage space on this train. This wasn't being enforced because of space restrictions or something. This is just a cynical cash grab by Via Rail, and that pisses me off. I love trains. As far as I'm concerned, when trains are done well, they are the most comfortable, enjoyable, relaxing, and all-around best way to travel. But Via Rail has ruined trains. By emulating all the worst parts of airline travel, they have made the train the worst possible option, and that's a problem. The vast majority of people traveling from Toronto to London will drive on Highway 401. This is the widest highway in all of North America, yet it's completely clogged with traffic at almost all times of the day. And so billions are being spent to widen it in a never-ending chain of construction projects. But as decades of studies have proven, there's no solution to car traffic except viable alternatives to driving. That doesn't mean that everybody needs to take the train, but it does mean you need to provide viable options for those who don't need to drive. But when you make train travel just as bad as airline travel while taking longer than driving, that's not a viable option, and traffic is never going to get better. Unfortunately, there are still far too many people in denial of that fact, either through ignorance or because they make more money keeping everybody in cars. If you'd like to learn more, I have a video about how adding more lanes doesn't fix traffic, link in the description. And if you don't want to learn more, well, enjoy sitting in traffic, I guess. I just hate that millions of people in the US and Canada will never know what it's like to ride a genuinely good train. And that makes me sad because trains can be so much better than this. I have several videos about train travel in many different countries, and I'll leave links to them in the description. Thanks for watching to the end of this video, I really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank all of my channel supporters who pay me to upgrade to business class. If you'd like to support this channel so that I can make more Traintastic content, the absolute best way to do that is by signing up to Nebula at go.nebula.tv/notjustbikes. On Nebula, you can watch all of my videos early, as well as thousands of videos from other talented creators, all ad-free and sponsor-free. Go to go.nebula.tv/notjustbikes or follow the link in the description to learn more.